step out here and take a look at the rest of the world. I'm going to talk about the global picture for swine and poultry. I've done a lot of work in this area over the last 5 or 6 years and come up with some, I hope, some interesting little tidbits that might be helpful to the audience. First of all, I'm going to start with the really big picture, which is what are 3 things that really matter in terms of how much meat we produce in the world. And I'm using the FAO database, which only goes through 2007, so I can't really at this point verify that this recession has had a big impact on the global meat industry, but it has certainly had a major impact in the developed world. And when you look at the regressions, there are only 3 things that really matter very much. One, how many people are there? 1% more per year, roughly, on a world scale, which adds to demand. How much money have they got to spend? And that what really matters there is the real buying power corrected for inflation. And finally, how much of that money are they willing to spend for meat? From 1961, which is where the FAO database starts, up till 2007, which is where it ends, per capita global meat consumption increased from 23 to 43 kilograms per person, with an R squared on that of 0.99. Now, if you know anything about stats and a little bit about math, you can take both sides of that equation, which are divided by population, multiply through by population, and then you're looking at total global meat consumption and total global purchasing power in real terms. And when you correlate global GDP and population with global meat consumption, you get an R squared of 0.999, almost perfect. And if you do the income elasticity, a 10% increase in per capita spending is about an 8% increase in per capita meat production or consumption in the world. And I'm going to use consumption and production independent as kind of synonyms for each other here, because what we produce on a global scale, we consume on a global scale, because the net trade is zero. The imports and exports match up. This is a graph of that relationship on a per capita basis with consumer expenditures on the left axis in 2,000 US dollars. That's from the World Bank. And then from the FAO on the right-hand side, we've got kilograms of meat per capita. And that's on a production basis, but again, it's the same as consumption with the R squared of 0.99. It's really going to be interesting to see when we get the 2009 numbers in, the final numbers, that the effects of income on and spending on per capita consumption. We can see, if we look back, for example, at the recession, the last big recession we had in the early 80s, which is just about in the middle of this chart, you can see both of those lines flattening out. And I suspect that that's what we're going to see when we get the 2009, 2008 numbers in from both the World Bank and FAO. FAO will lag well behind the World Bank numbers. In fact, we probably won't get 2009 numbers in from FAO until 2011. Notice also that the boom in the 1990s caused that somewhat accelerated increase in per capita consumption, and it really tracks very, very well. The flattening out there, in fact, is in 2005. It's kind of hard to explain, but we'll see, because it can't explain it with income, but still that correlation is pretty high. So if you're an economist, you're saying, well, wait a minute now, whoa, here, just a second, what about prices? When price goes up, consumption goes down. Well, that's true on a local scale, but on a global scale, when we look at global average meat prices, the ups and downs tend to wash out, and yes, prices do go up and down, but they're too stable to have any effect on this scale of things. Probably have affected shares of meat in the diet, because poultry is traditionally much less expensive than beef and a little less expensive than pork in a lot of markets around the world, not true everywhere. But when we look at how well poultry has competed on a global scale and in the U.S., prices probably have played a role in that. consumer demographics, taste, and preferences have huge impacts in terms of particular geographies, but over time they don't change all that fast or all that much, and so they haven't really had any effect at all that I can see on global meat consumption over all these geographies. There's a paradox here, too, in that if you drill down into a very small micro level of individual purchase decisions in individual markets at particular points in time, income still matters, but what really matters in that situation is taste and preferences and relative prices. So, if you look at this thing on the micro scale, it's very different from looking at it on this big global scale, where those things tend to wash out over time and over geography. So I'm not denying that a lot of the things that Steve has talked about in terms of the poultry or the pork market are important, because they are very important in the U.S. But again, on a global scale, they do tend to wash out. Okay, been using this slide with a lot of clients because things have really changed. We in the meat industry in general had two huge tailwinds, kind of two jet streams driving us in the 90s and early 2000s. We had real income that was going up, which causes an increase in demand, and we had real cost, corrected for inflation, going down. Corn was, $2 to $2.50 a bushel, had been for years, except for a couple of droughts. You take inflation out of that, and our feed costs have been declining over time, as had energy cost as well. And that is also a plus for meat, because it enables us to compete with other industries and other industries that are competing for the consumer's dollar very effectively. In effect, basically what I'm saying here is that you had real meat costs in retail that were declining relative to everything else the consumer has in their market basket, and you had incomes increasing. That is a dynamite formula for increasing the size of an industry. And you can think about computers, for example, real costs going down much faster, of course, than meat, but look at how that industry has exploded. And we were bringing real costs down as well, so we had a little bit of that tailwind, but the big thing was the increases in income that we had worldwide. In 2008, all of that changed, and now we're looking at major headwinds. As our other two speakers have indicated, our costs have gone up, and on a global scale, we're also experiencing a recession. So it's no wonder that, particularly in the developed world, where we have seen the major impacts from this recession. There are countries around the world that don't even realize that we've had a recession, but in the developed world where this recession has been concentrated is where we've seen the real impact. So if we look at the 2010 outlook, in the OECD, which is basically the developed countries of the world, it's the U.S., Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the first world countries, we will see positive economic growth. But normally, coming out of this kind of a recession, we would expect to see a 5 to 6% local growth in real GDP kind of number. But particularly here in the U.S., we've got this huge overhang of debt. And that, on both the consumer and the business side, is causing some pretty conservative spending. And particularly businesses are trying to beef up their balance sheets with more cash. And consumers who've seen their 401ks and IRAs decline and their housing values decline suddenly realize that those things aren't such a great bet for retirement, and they're saving more money as well. So we've seen actually business spending and consumer spending deaccelerate and decline faster than GDP, which is not a good thing for demand for meat. The developing world is leading the recovery. Their numbers are going to be significantly better next year than the developed world. So that will have, on a global scale, a significant impact on meat production and meat demand, because I think it's going to grow faster in the developing world than in the developed world. And that's going to be determined by how fast GDP and consumer spending grow. And of course, we've had a lot of issues already discussed about cost and the feed cost, and I'm not going to go over that because the last two speakers have done an excellent job. This is the World Bank's forecast as of the 4th of November. I just copied their numbers. These are not my numbers. I'll give the World Bank credit for them. And you can see the disparity here between the high-income OECD countries, and I've broken that out by the European area, Japan, and the U.S., versus the developing world, where actually we had a deacceleration in growth, but particularly in the Middle East and South Asia, certainly a slowdown, but not what we would call a recession at all. The total world GDP is expected to shrink in real terms by about 3%. The high-income countries is where it's concentrated, minus 4.2%. The developing countries in total, slight growth, obviously well below the 8.1% from 2 years ago, but still growing. And if we look at the 2010 forecast, the developed world at about 1.3%, the developing world getting back to about half the growth rate of 2007 and continuing to accelerate through 2011 to 5.7%. So demand will recover first in the developing world, which is probably good news for our exports. Demand growth here in the U.S. will be muted by this relatively slow U-shaped recovery. We still have unemployment going up in this country. Things are not improving all that rapidly in Europe either, although they're in a little better shape than we are. I don't think that feed costs are going to be any lower, but there is a little bit of good news here in that we're starting to rebuild global grain stocks, and I'm really surprised that no one else has mentioned this, that if you look at, on a global scale, the instability we've had in grain prices and oilseed prices over the last few years, certainly a lot of that's due to ethanol, but more fundamentally, we were using more grain than we were consuming even prior to the ethanol boom. We had grain stocks on a global scale at over 500 million tons in the early 2000s, declining to 300 or so million tons by 2007, 2008. And on top of ethanol, and ethanol was part of this obviously because they were using a lot of grain, that really added to the price instability. We're going to be back up to something like 400, 450 million tons at the end of the 2009-2010 marketing year, and that's going to help us out in terms of price stability, we think. But certainly not in terms of the level of grain prices and oilseed prices. And I certainly agree with the prior two speakers that there's a very high correlation between energy prices now and grain prices. I tend to correlate corn prices with the New York gasoline market simply because corn wants to be about twice the price of wholesale gasoline in the New York market. It's just a nice little rule of thumb. It works a little better than crude oil, Steve. Try the R-squares on it. Global meat production is the normal. It's the normal because every year we have a population increase and every year we have had some real GDP increases. Outside of a couple of episodes in the 80s, and even then meat production didn't decline. This year we may see a small decline, and on a per capita basis, global meat production will decline in 2009. That's historic. This is something that is unprecedented. U.S. total meat consumption peaked in 2007, has declined in 2008, and will decline in 2009, and USDA is currently forecasting that it will decline again in 2010. Insofar as I know, this is the first time we've ever seen a 3-year decline in history. I haven't checked the 1930s, but I doubt very seriously that we've ever seen this kind of a decline. There's the global meat production numbers, and you can see how unusual 2009 is. And this is U.S. total meat consumption. This is not per capita. 2007 will likely be the high water mark for quite a few years in terms of total U.S. meat consumption and also in terms of per capita meat consumption. This industry is shrinking, and it's shrinking because of higher cost first, and secondly because of the 2008-2009 recession. And yes, by 2011 we may start to grow again, but it will be a long time before we ever get back to that 2007 level, if ever. Okay, getting to the species. Broiler production is night and day depending upon what part of the world you're in. Latin America is looking like a bright spot. China has been a real growth area in terms of broiler production, but the recovery in pork production is holding down their growth rates. And Russian production is going to benefit as they cut back on their tariff rate quotas, which is the amount that's allowed in at very concessionary rates. These are, and I apologize for the fact there's a lot of small numbers here, but if you look up and down the growth forecast for 2010, you can certainly see a wide range of numbers, anywhere from 10% for Russia, and that's a policy decision that they've made to cut back on imports and encourage local production, all the way to 0% for Japan, but that's not news for Japan. They haven't grown in decades, really. And the U.S. number of only 1% growth for broiler production next year. That's compared to historic rates of 3 to 5%. Very slow growth in the U.S. In terms of exports, I'm expecting, I don't think USDA is, but I'm expecting that this reduced Russian quota is going to cost us net some export volume next year. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Thailand will see some growth because they have access to the EU market, and the EU is becoming very quickly a net importer of broiler meat because their cost of production simply is not competitive with the rest of the world. So if you look at exports next year, Latin America, some of the smaller countries, Australia, a 14% increase, but they don't export much anyway, so it's a very small volume. But Brazil with 6% growth, a lot of that going to the Middle East and in Europe. Chile, primarily Europe, and Thailand, primarily Europe. United States, I'm expecting a small decline as the Russian volume drops. We also produce turkeys in this country, and let's take a quick look at that. 2010 U.S. turkey production, after declining substantially this year, will be down again slightly next year. We have some major issues with stocks, and we're trying to work those off. We need to get down to about 250 million pounds of year-ending stocks. We're only going to be at about 350 million, so we're going to carry some surplus stocks into 2010. It's going to take a little longer to work those off, but we are getting them worked down. In fact, last week we've had a record reduction in stocks as a lot of supermarkets have had some really hot specials on turkeys, and they're trying to replenish their stocks, in-store stocks ahead of Thanksgiving holiday. In fact, there were reports that some waters didn't get filled. Brazilian growth stopped this year and will resume next year, and they'll be exporting more primarily to Europe. And let's just move on to the slide. This is the summary. There aren't very many turkey producers in the world that amount to much. Brazil is a real comer. Canada is quota controlled, so their production doesn't vary very much from year to year. But I think you can see the EU 27, why they're becoming a net turkey importer. Their production in 2009, 2010 is actually less than 2005. And demand really hasn't changed very much. That difference is being filled by imports. U.S. this year, a substantial reduction in turkey output, and another one next year. And all that reduction will be in the first half of the year, by the way. The second half will probably see some year-on-year growth, pretty modest, but some. And you can see that how the turkey exports globally are increasing. In the EU 27, you can see that decline in exports. And again, that's all being imported, and they are now a net turkey importer, fairly significantly, in fact. In terms of global, I call it pig meat here because some people don't like the term pork, so I'm going to use the euphemism. Canada, EU, and the U.S. have been very slow, as we know, to adjust these higher costs, and Steve covered that in detail. We've had 2 years of continuous losses, basically, except for, I think, a month or two on the Iowa State basis, and very modest declines in sow numbers. Producers in the developed world should not be in any kind of financial position to expand production in 2010, and that applies pretty much everywhere, not just the U.S. The developing world is in better shape, particularly China, and we will see some production growth there. Steve had a different version of this chart. The green line down at the bottom is the profit or loss per month. It's the difference between the blue line and the red line, and I think you can see that actually this profitability decline really started back in 2006, even before the ethanol industry really took off in this country. And the basic problem, as we've already heard, is that we have too much pork for our export and local demand, and we're going to have to cut back on our numbers, even though demand is likely to improve a bit next year in the United States. In terms of the global situation, we've already heard about the problems in Canada. They are leading the decline in 2010 pork production, down about 7% next year, maybe more, depending on the impact of the strong Canadian dollar on them. We could be looking at as much as 10% decline in Canada. In terms of production growth, China will lead the world as they have traditionally for quite some time. Brazil is also still coming on fairly strong with 4% growth next year, and a lot of that destined to the export market. I've got the U.S. down at 3% for next year. I wish it was going to be more because it's going to take more than that to get us back to profitability. In terms of exports, we will see some pickup next year as the developed world recovers slower than the developing world. We'll probably see demand in developing economies outgrow their production capacity, so we should see some pickup in global trade next year, which is good news for us and Brazil both. This is my forecast for U.S. And the rest of the world in terms of exports. Brazil up about 9% next year. Mexico up 10%, but again, that's a small number. And the U.S. up about 7%, getting back to some pretty good numbers. What is really important for 2010 is in pig production is we need, in the developed world, U.S. and Europe both, to reduce production. The second headline is demand will improve a bit, and prices will therefore improve. The question is what is the trajectory of this production cut, and how fast is it going to happen? That's really going to determine what happens to prices. I've taken just a quick look at an overview here of margins. You can see the sources down at the bottom. And I think you can see here the really horrible situation that we're in 2009. Fed cattle, on average, forecast to lose almost $9 a hundredweight. Pigs at about almost $8 a hundredweight. Broilers had a little profitability window in spring and summer, and they're actually going to make a little money, but they should. They cut back production a lot more than anybody else. The turkey industry is also hurting, losing about as much money per pound as fed cattle are. And the dairy industry, that is not profitability, that is margin over feed cost. $4.52, I think, is a record low for margin over feed cost, and that's based on some Penn State University numbers. The second half of the year improved a bit, and then 2010, with their ongoing production cuts, the margin forecast still don't point to normal profitability, but at least some improvement over where we were, particularly the first half of 2009. I'd also point out the beef production sector is an important part of this. production in beef is shrinking almost everywhere in the world. Argentina is leading the charge to lower beef production because of government policy that penalizes exports and tries to divert product into the domestic market to keep prices low, but that is self-defeating because beef producers are liquidating and getting out of the business in domestic, and basically what they're doing is they're reducing production about as fast as they are exports. And elsewhere in the world is simply low profitability, except for 3 countries. India, of all things, India could very well surpass Argentina in 2010 as the world's 4th largest beef producer. Brazil, export demand is leading the charge, and in Uruguay also we're looking for some recovery in beef production because of increasing export demand. Brazil and Argentina export to a wide variety of countries, but the EU outlook for beef and also Russia next year is pretty grim in terms of production, and they will probably see some increase in volume to those 2 markets. The reason I point this out is this is a pretty significant opportunity for pigs and poultry around the world. Beef production declining 13% next year in Argentina, and that's a huge decline. That's a fairly important producer in the world. And as I've indicated, that production decline will come primarily out of trade. They're going to export substantially less, which opens up export opportunities for other meats. Certainly not beef, because if you look up and down that list, there really aren't many countries that are looking at any kind of substantial increase in beef production next year. Other than Brazil, Uruguay, and India, we're looking at declines almost everywhere else in the world. And as this industry, and it is sick in a lot of different places for a lot of different reasons, but it's not a healthy situation for beef producers, particularly those that are in the cattle feeding business. This is a significant opportunity for our poultry and pork producers around the world. There are some bright spots, but in order to get back to profitability, as our other 2 speakers have indicated, in the U.S. swine industry, we are looking at some further production cuts in 2010 and probably not a real bright outlook for 2011 in terms of production growth. But I think the big swing we're going to see is profitability in both pigs and poultry globally next year as we finally get supplies closer in line with demand.